Vasudeva. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we're in a little section of the Gita. Krishna's just laid out what I would generally describe as a traditional classical yoga practice. The word yoga goes back farther than the idea of using the term to designate one connecting with God. The term's used in secular senses, and it occurs in a number of different contexts in the early Sanskrit literature of ancient India. It means war. It's used astrologically speaking. It's used in spiritual senses. It kind of gets used in a number of ways in the Rig Veda, the oldest Vedic text. But by the time the Upanishads rolled around, which are also part of the oldest stratum of the Vedic literature, but they're not quite as old as the Samhitas. They're not quite as old as the original songs of the Vedas. In fact, the Upanishads in some ways are commentaries on those original songs of the Vedas that give esoteric meaning. In the Upanishads you get, a traditional yoga practice, sitting quietly, focusing the eyes on the bridge of the eyebrow or the tip of the nose, the bridge of the nose. Control your breath, equalizing your breath between your ingoing and your outgoing breath. Sitting with your head, your neck, and your back in a straight line. Half closing your eyes. Meditating on the infinite. That kind of stuff. I like to call that a traditional yoga, a classical yoga. It goes back to the early Vedic literature. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of a hatha yoga, which would be a more medieval style of yoga. It's more alchemical. There's more, like with bandhas and mudras, you're generally speaking pushing ojas around, kind of subtle sexual energy that's meant to move up through the chakras. The chakras get invoked. There's some sort of sense in which a lot of times you get into straight up alchemy with, consuming treated mercury that's been treated with mica or sulfur and had gold dissolved into it. When chemically reacts with it, but doesn't increase the volume of the mercury. When it gets activated with the mica or the sulfur, then you put gold into it and it just disappears. It chemically reacts with the mercury and does not appear to increase in size. It just stays the same and swallows the gold. And then you eat that mercury and it's like you're eating gold, and precious metals were considered to be very healthy, in all alchemical traditions, really, to be honest. That practice of yoga, real intense asana, funky pranayams, some tantra mixed in there, some sexual tantra mixed in there, a lot of focus on semen and feminine fluids and stuff like that. That all came much later. Cutting a frenum in your tongue so you can reach your tongue back and touch your pineal gland, and drinking your own urine, and there's all sorts of kind of wild practices that became fairly standard in the yogi world as yoga became more about obtaining superhuman powers, and it became less about achieving self-realization. Usually, even in that medieval literature, there was no homage that you will attain superhuman powers and then will achieve self-realization. So even then, they had some concept that there was some sort of liberation at the tail end of it, but they started to become fascinated with powers. And then that's why the yogis were like the boogeymen of medieval India. Like the gypsies of medieval India, they blow into town and corrupt all the women and steal all the wealth, and bad things would happen, and you don't want to cross them, and they got bad, juju that they can throw at you, stuff like that. That I don't consider to be a classical yoga. That's a little bit more of a modern yoga. And so the classical yoga is a lot more, you could just say pure, in the sense of it has a lot less ritual attached. It's much more about meditation and self-realization. So Krishna lays out a classical yoga in the 6th chapter of the Gita, which is usually titled Dhyana Yoga, or the yoga of meditation. And Arjuna reacts negatively to it. Now, Nick, you'd asked earlier in the week, watching my class, could it be that this yoga could be seen for a grihastha, for a householder, as being something that you did every day? So you would go to a quiet place and pacify your mind. And then it could also be seen as an entire way of life for a renunciate. And that those two distinct readings aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Yes, certainly you could read it that way. There's nothing wrong with reading it that way. I don't think I articulated fully why it could, why they weren't mutually exclusive, but certainly they are not mutually exclusive. The thing is, if Arjuna was just being told to go meditate for an hour or two a day, would he have reacted as strongly as he did? He would not have. So that reading, although not terrible, it just doesn't flow with the flavor of the chapter. When Arjuna hears about this yoga practice that would, really be attractive to him because it would get him out of fighting against his relatives, his reaction is, the system of yoga you've summarized appears impractical and unendurable to me. For the mind is restless and unsteady. I can't imagine Arjuna having such a reaction if he was being told to go meditate for an hour a day. The mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong, Krishna, and to subdue it, I think, is more difficult than controlling the wind. This reaction, to me, leans strongly in favor of looking at this as a traditional yoga. I gave the other version for someone who really can't deal with Krishna pulling something out of his sleeve and doing a change-up. And so it was a way to reconcile it. But I don't feel that it does honor to a straight read of the chapter. And it also doesn't really explain Arjuna's reaction. So Krishna says, it's undoubtedly very difficult to curb the restless mind, but it's possible by abhyas and vairagya. Those are interesting because those two terms are used in the Yoga Sutras as the defining features of the original yoga described by Patanjali. Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, which is a later text on classical yoga. It's later than the Gita. It's later than the Upanishads, but it's not as modern as the Hatha Yoga literature that came, at the beginning of the first millennium. So this would be, the Yoga Sutras would be older. And the Yoga Sutras have a few different yogas they describe. They have one yoga they describe which is called Kriya Yoga. It consists of tapas, saladhyaya, and Ishvara pranidhan, focusing on God, performing austerities, and studying. And then there's an earlier yoga that's described at the beginning of the text, and that earlier yoga consists of abhyas and vairagya, practice and dispassion. And it's interesting that you find in an earlier text those exact same words are used. In fact, some of the definitions of yoga in this chapter are almost exactly the same as Patanjali's. They use very similar language. And so that would also lend support to the idea that what Krishna was describing was more of a traditional yoga that involved, it was a full-time engagement. And so, he was using language which was similar to the language used by that tradition to define itself later on. Does that make sense? So you could imagine, if I was speaking to you in proper Spanish, right? And you were trying to sort of figure out, what I'm trying to communicate. It wasn't completely clear. And I'm speaking to you in proper Spanish. And you're trying to use that to determine where I'm from and what I'm communicating. But it's not 100% clear. Like somehow your knowledge of Spanish and my knowledge of Spanish, they don't quite add up. I'm a little enigmatic, and we're trying to determine what my meaning is. And then you're able to show that I'm using certain language, right, which is only really used in Mexico. Like ahorita is used in Mexico to mean right now. Or even they use ahoritita, right now, like this very minute. But in other countries, in South America, Latin America, other Spanish-speaking countries, they don't use ahorita. They use ahora. And they don't use them both. Ahorita is more immediate. It means like right this minute, whereas ahora means now. You use ahorita in Colombia? You do. It's not used in all Spanish-speaking countries. And so there started to be like language that was only used in Mexico. How about ahoritita? You don't use that, right? That's pure Mexican, right?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it is used in Colombia, but it's a lower, like maybe slang.
It's slang, but you don't remember hearing it, right? Yeah, it's Mexican, Spanish. And so now we start to look at like what's being said, and we notice that they're using words that are really Mexican. They're not just Spanish. And now as we're trying to determine the meaning of the word, for instance, of linda, which means clean, but it really means like beautiful, or guapa, which also means like handsome, but it also means beautiful, or bonita, or hermosa. There's all these words that are used to indicate beauty in Spanish. And those words are being used, but we're not exactly sure what's intended, because the words have different meanings in different areas of Latin America. You follow? But then we notice that the speaker is dropping Spanish. They're using Spanish-style Mexican. Mexican-style Spanish. And then we have a very strong argument that we should then understand those somewhat enigmatic terms in the way that they're used in Mexico. You follow? It's kind of a sophisticated hermeneutic. It's a sophisticated way of trying to figure out what's intended by the author. Most people wouldn't be able to follow it because they don't know. They don't know the difference between different types of Spanish. They don't know the regional dialects. They would just kind of get lost, right? Similar to this, I think a strong case could be made that what Krishna is intending here is a classical yoga. I can render the verses the other way to mean more of just a daily practice. But there's some holes. It's not a perfect fit. It's a better fit if you understand it as a classical system of yoga. If you try to say both meanings are true and he means both things simultaneously, there's no problem with that. But if you're trying to understand what is intended, the more specific and the more you can get to one meaning, the better off you are. I don't feel that this is so enigmatic that it's really equally readable in two ways. I think it's primarily readable in one way. And one strong piece of evidence, amongst a number of pieces of evidence, is Arjuna's reaction. And it's not a small piece of evidence. It's not a small piece of evidence. Arjuna has this immediate feeling that he could not do this practice, but who can't do a little bit of meditation? I mean, he went and he lived in the forest for 14 years. He was, he underwent a period of ostracizing. What do you call that? They were ostracized. They were exiled. He lived in a period of exile, like incredibly austerely. He was an incredible sadhaka. You follow? All right. I hope you guys were able to follow that. I don't know if you could or not, but that's me trying to really argue a bit more. And there's a lot of arguments like this. I spared you guys. But you look at the language and you look at the reactions, even the Abhyasa and Vairagya, Arjun's reaction, and there's more. That's just what's right here in front of me now. We go back in the chapter and there's other stuff. The idea of controlling the mind from all sides, from wherever it wanders, doesn't sound like just a part-time practice. The idea of celibacy doesn't sound like a part-time practice. That's fundamentally at odds with being married. Now you can say, well, you're celibate if you're married, you only have sex for procreation. You go that route, and there's nothing wrong with that argument. But the living in a quiet place, sitting on a raised platform, not eating too much or too little, also something very big in the yoga literature, and then also being celibate, all that language put together, it starts to point you strongly in the direction of a full-time renunciation, which is so at odds with what Krishna said previously, that some people can't deal with it, and therefore I offer the alternate reading. Not because I think both readings are equally valid. Of course, if somebody was supposed to become vegetarian or vegan and they couldn't, and you allowed them, you said, okay, yeah, so eat eggs, what's the big deal? Or, whatever it is that they're doing, eating cheese but not looking to see that's from protected animals, or that it's, that the enzymes used are for sure microbial. You could see yourself encouraging someone to give up eating, animals that feel more pain, and limit their consumption of animals to things lower on the totem pole that feel less pain. Fish, eggs, something like that, where there's less, pain or suffering involved. That doesn't mean that's your argument. It just means that there's some value in, moving in the right direction. So if what's taught in the chapter is to do a 24-hour yoga practice where you renounce the world, and all somebody could muster was an hour or two out of their life, then certainly that's a step in the right direction, even if it's not what's intended by the text. Did that give you a little bit more of a reconciliation there, Nick? I don't always go into it with you guys all the way. I mean, last week I got into it with you guys, and people were challenged. It was difficult. Nobody could focus. And it was problematic. And so I still got to pick and choose my battles with you guys, because otherwise we spend years on a few verses. It's not like we can't go into these things in more detail. It's not like I'm giving you guys the limit of what I see in the verses, the limit of what I see, what's there. I mean, what's in those verses is unlimited. But even just what I'm able to see, which is limited, isn't necessarily something that we'd be able to go into. And it's almost like even if I did go through it, you wouldn't follow it. Even if I did spend a few weeks on a couple of verses and really fleshed them out, then at the end of the day, I'd say, okay, what'd you understand? And you'd be like, oh, you said something nice about not being the body, and you told us not to be attached to the results of our work. You get what you can get. If your cup's only so big, you can only take so much. Your cup's only so big, then however much you fill it up, the rest of the water just goes off and flows down the side of the cup, onto the ground. And so we make passes through the Gita, and then depending on our level of depth, we get more or less information, and we make pass after pass after pass through the text, and we let the water wear away the stone. And as we develop in our own spiritual life, then we see things we didn't see before. More and more comes out. Good questions help. Good questions are inspirational. It's like if somebody asks you a really good question, like, oh, you're like a legit student, so now I'm going to have to, I'm going to give you, I was giving you my C game, now I have to give you my B game. So that there's nothing wrong with asking good questions. But anyway, that's me giving another layer. Okay? All right. So Arjuna has this really negative reaction. And then Krishna answers back and says, you can do it. For one whose mind is unbridled, self-realization is difficult work. It's probably a translation of the word yukta. Let me take a look here. No, it's asamyata. That's all right. I mean, it means uncontrolled. For one whose mind is uncontrolled. Unbridled is cool because yoga means yoke. So if something's yoga'd, it's yoked. And so unbridled would be a great translation of ayukta. Because if you bridle something, then you control it. If it's unbridled, it's like a, rabid dog or something like that. Because if you say unbridled like a Mustang, that's like a cool thing, like an unbridled horse. But that's not really what's being communicated. It's more like a rabid dog, a rabid animal. For one whose mind is unbridled, self-realization is difficult work. But he whose mind is controlled and who strives by appropriate means is assured of success. That's my opinion. All right, so Krishna, he doesn't whimper away or something like that. He's ready to double down and tell Arjuna to step up to the plate. And it's not impossible. So Krishna lays out a traditional yoga. Arjuna balks at it. Like it really has like an adverse reaction. He's really averse to it. He has an adverse reaction. And Krishna responds back and says, no, it's tough, but you can do it. And now Arjuna asks a little bit more of a nuanced, he expressed a little bit more of a nuanced doubt. His first one was like, this is crazy. It's like controlling the wind. Like, what do you even mean? Like, how is that even possible? Krishna, what's the destination of the unsuccessful transcendentalist who in the beginning takes the process of self-realization with faith? He's shraddhayopeta. He's endowed with faith. He has shraddha. But he later desists due to worldly mindedness, and thus he does not attain perfection in mysticism. You follow this? What happens to somebody who has faith, who starts a traditional yoga, but who fails? Now, Krishna understands this question, according to the commentators, Krishna understands this question as two questions. What happens if I spend my whole life trying, but I don't achieve the goal? What happens if I start, but then I stop? Krishna appears to, according to the commentators and his answers, understand that Arjuna is asking two questions. You follow? That's a lot more of a nuanced That's a lot more of a nuanced doubt that's being expressed. It's not just, I can't do this is too much. It's, all right, if I did try this and I failed and I didn't make it, what happens to me? If I did try this and I failed and I didn't make it, see, it's two questions, right? I failed, like I fell away, or I didn't make it all the way, but I didn't stop trying. What happens to me? It's quite a sincere question. And this question, although it might on the surface seem to be a question asked by Arjuna to Krishna, it's really everybody's question. If I decide to become a devotee and take vows and dedicate my life to self-realization, and I fall away, or I don't make it back to Godhead, what happens to me when I die? The question might seem Christian or like a bit like whatever, but that's just because everybody's a materialist and nobody thinks in these terms. People are just thinking about like what's going to happen tomorrow. Nobody has the ability to think long term. If you look at people, they make short-term decisions. They don't make long-term decisions. They make short-term decisions and they dress them up as long-term decisions. You follow? That's what people in the world do. They do what's sensually pleasing today, tomorrow, next week. Right? And then they try to like put whipped cream on garbage and make themselves sound sophisticated and like they've thought it all through. Does that make sense? Arjuna's question isn't like that. It's the question of somebody who's realizes he's the soul, understands there's a higher purpose to human life, and has like very real concerns about giving his word or committing to something and not being able to follow through. It's a serious question from a serious individual. And like I said before, as a teacher, I'm not always given everything I have to my students because it just gets gratuitous or indulgent. Who am I talking to? If nobody's going to follow what I say, who am I talking to? And so I got to teach at a level people can understand. But when somebody does understand and they ask me a pertinent question that indicates that they're really trying to understand, that's inspiring to me. That helps me go bigger than I would normally go. I'm repeating myself now. Do you remember me saying this? This is relevant. It's important. Because Krishna gets inspired by Arjuna's question. And this section of the Gita is unlike any other section of the Gita. There's something really special about it that we're going to look at. There are other sections of the Gita which are like this. I retract my previous statement. But there's something Krishna does here that I find to be very endearing. So listen up, because we're going to finish the chapter now. Does not such a man who is bewildered from the path of transcendence fall away from both spiritual and material success and perish like a riven cloud with no position in any sphere? You got it? The first one is aprapya yoga samsiddhim. He doesn't achieve the perfection of yoga. The second question. He's yoga vibrashta. This one is he's yoga vibrashta. He's yoga brashta. He falls away from yoga. The last one is he doesn't achieve. The first one was he doesn't achieve perfection. The second question, he's a yoga brashta. He falls away from yoga. He deviates from yoga. His yoga is broken. You follow? So that's where the two questions come from. The two verses indicate two questions. And Arjuna says, this is my doubt, and I ask you to dispel it completely, but for you no one is to be found who can destroy this doubt. That's nice too. It's like a disciple, has faith in his guru. He has faith in his guru, but not so much faith that he doesn't ask questions. It's not a blind faith. But he does put his doubts before Krishna in a very plain, straightforward, guileless fashion. and gives Krishna a chance to respond and to answer. And so Krishna responds back and he says, a transcendentalist engaged in auspicious activities does not meet with destruction, either in this world or in the spiritual world. One who does good, my friend, is never overcome by evil. So Krishna's first answer is, you're not going to be destroyed. Nothing bad is going to happen to you in this world or in the next world. If you're kalyan krit, if you do good, you'll never be overcome by durgati. You never go to a bad place. Durgati literally means a bad place. You never go to a bad place if you're doing good. That's Krishna's first answer. And Krishna calls Arjuna Tata. Tata means my son. It's the only place in the Gita where Krishna calls Arjuna Tata, my son. It's a term of endearment in Sanskrit. He calls Arjuna Mahabaho, great armed one, meaning like, your arms are so big, why don't you control your mind? You've made your body strong, make your mind strong. So he'll use different words, parantapa, scorcher of foes. So that's like, how come you can't deal with your doubts? You can deal with your enemies on the battlefield so expertly, but how come you can't deal with your own doubts? So Arjuna will speak to Krishna and he'll use epithets or names for Arjuna that highlight the point he's trying to communicate. This one is unique. It's the only place in the Gita where Krishna calls Arjuna Tata. And Prabhupada renders it here as my friend, which isn't bad either. It's not wrong. It's a term of endearment. It can be used towards seniors or juniors. But the primary meaning is my son. And I think the context fits quite well. Arjuna is scared. He's frightened. He's really, he's very genuine. He has faith and he's frightened. And he approaches Krishna in this very sincere way. Krishna's recommended this thing to him. He had a adverse reaction initially. And then Krishna doubled down, and Arjuna's taking it seriously, but he's really worried. But if Krishna wants him to do something, he's not gonna avoid it. But nonetheless, he places his doubts in front of Krishna in a very plain way and puts that burden on his guru. And has this doubt that he expresses very plainly. And Krishna, immediately, his mood softens tremendously. And all of a sudden we're far away from a text on yoga and controlling the mind from all sides like a lamp in a windless place. You know what I mean? We've all of a sudden we're gone from there, and he's saying, my son, nothing bad's going to happen to you. You're going to be okay. It's for me, it's beyond sweet. It's magical. And the language is unmistakable. The affection that's dripping from Krishna's words is unmistakable. And so, you can miss this. You cannot see it, but it's there if you have eyes to see it. It's there. It's in the language. In the same way that somebody who speaks Mexican Spanish, they know exactly what's going on with different terminology. They have a feel for the language that non-native speakers don't have. They understand what's intended. And so Sanskrit also has a feel to it. And so there's an intimacy created in Krishna's answer. And the intimacy is caused by Arjuna's sincerity and his question. He asked a really good question, and that really good question inspired Krishna to speak very powerfully on this subject. But he also spoke with a lot of affection. The unsuccessful yogi, after many, many years of enjoyment on the planets of pious living entities, is born into a family of righteous people or into a family of rich aristocracy. So this is the yoga brashta, the one who's fallen from the path of yoga. He's yoga brashta. What happens? He goes to pious places. He's not to the spiritual world. He eventually comes back into this world, but when he takes birth in this world, he takes birth in a family of shuchis, of Brahmins, or a family of Srimatas, a family of opulent people. So he takes birth in a family of Brahmanas, or, Kshatriyas is most probably what's indicated by Srimat. So he takes place in a family of Srimatis or Shuchis. And so that's what happens to the yoga brashta. He enjoys in pious abodes, not heaven with a capital H, that's even further up, but he enjoys in the material world, in auspicious planes of existence. Eventually has to come back to this world because he has not achieved perfection. When he comes back in this world, his practice of yoga, his sincere practice from that lifetime, results in him being born into a very auspicious circumstance. A lot of times you'll say to somebody who's born with a silver spoon in their mouth, you didn't do anything to earn your wealth. Of course, that worldview is atheistic and it's chaotic. If you believe in karma, then certainly they did do something to deserve that. You follow? And the circumstance you're born into is very much a reflection of what you did. You can see the results of people's actions by what happens to them. Or, if unsuccessful after a long practice of yoga, he takes birth in a family of transcendentalists. So these are dematis. These are like broad-minded people. These are sages. Not just brahmanas, but sages. He takes birth in a family of sages. Such a birth, who are surely great in wisdom. Certainly such a birth is rare in this world. On taking such a birth, he revives his divine consciousness of his previous birth and again strives to make further progress in order to achieve complete success. So now you've got if somebody broke away, they get blessed. But if somebody never gave up, then they take birth in this world and they pick up right where they left off. They're born into a situation where they're just naturally going to be able to pick up where they left off. This, of course, doesn't indicate there's no free will, but it does indicate that you've entered into a process that death can't stop. Of course, you could say, what's the evidence of this? And my response to that would be, what evidence would you like? You follow? I don't think that this lends itself well to an investigation because we can't trace somebody from lifetime to lifetime. I think if we could trace people from lifetime to lifetime, free will would kind of go out the window and things would get real creepy real fast. I think forgetfulness is actually a blessing. So I think the most we can do here is we can say this is certainly congruent with an all-good, all-powerful God in a fair world. And then what we're left with is trying to prove an all-good, all-powerful God in a fair world. Really, we're trying to prove an all-good and all-powerful God, because if God was all-good and all-powerful, the world would automatically be fair. And so what you need to do if somebody wants evidence for something like this is you need to turn it back a notch and argue for the things that you actually can make really good arguments for, and then demonstrate that this is in congruence with those points you established. You know? Kobe Bryant, who's now sort of like a deity for some people, because this happens when people pass away. They become deified, nostalgized. He spoke of having a real lack of fear about competition because he prepared and he could depend on his training. It's something you see from a lot of high-level athletes. The battles won before they ever step into the arena. It's all the countless hours they put into preparing. Athletes, at least in the fighting game, get injured way more often in practice than they do in competition because the practices are so brutal. So I remember one of my friends was fighting in the UFC, and we were training him, and it's like he would cry sometimes. We would go round after round with no break for him, but we were fresh. So there'd be like 5 of us. We'd do 10 rounds. So we'd do 2 rounds, but he'd do 10 rounds, but we would get a break, but he would get no break. You follow? And by the end, he was just crying, barely hanging on by a thread, like actually crying in the ring. And so that's what happens, because fatigue makes cowards of us all. It kills everything. You become, if you were a 10, you become a 2 if you're tired enough. And so you gotta have to take people into those deep waters just so they can learn how to swim in those deep waters. Navy SEALs, part of their training is to drown themselves. They sit at the bottom of a pool with weights, and they do puzzles until they pass out and drown. And then people jump in the water and pull them out and revive them. But they got to be able to focus till that last second when they pass out. Does that make sense? And so, even in the material world, people do this kind of thing. And then they don't have any fear because they've prepped. Now Krishna's taking us beyond just this world. But it's certainly congruent. If you can prove an all-good and all-powerful deity, it would be a fair world. And if you weren't able to achieve success, but you had a sincere desire, you'd be allowed to come back. And so I think it's important with some points that you're trying to prove that if you can demonstrate that it's coherent, that itself is something valuable. Then if the thing you're talking about defies, an evidence-based approach, then you can look at the soundness of the position and the reasonableness of the position. And if it is, then you've done your job. When you're talking about things that, there'll always be a theory. It will always be a theory, but it becomes a very good theory. Evolution is a theory. So many things are theories. But if they're good enough theories, then that's enough. If it's untestable, but it's a good enough theory, then they've done their job. And so Krishna makes this point that you'll come back again and you'll have a chance to complete your process. And that's certainly an all-good and all-powerful God would for sure arrange that. By virtue of the divine consciousness of his previous life, he automatically becomes attracted to yoga principles, even without seeking them. It says helplessly. Avasha means helplessly. Such an inquisitive transcendentalist stands always above the ritualistic principles of the scriptures. So scriptures are filled with rules and regulations, right? But this transcendentalist who's actually just says the one who's inquisitive about yoga is above the scriptures. It's literally what it says. Ati Vartate, he goes beyond. Shabda Brahman, the Brahman word, the word Brahman, meaning the scriptures. It's a term that means scriptures. Who? The Jigyasu Api Yogasya, even the one who's inquisitive about yoga. It's a glorification. Like that desire to achieve yoga, that sincere interest, that inquisitiveness, that desire to know. That's everything. And so Krishna critiques the ritual of Scripture, glorifies the interest in things transcendental, reassures Arjuna, calls him his son, gives a couple of options, a rich, powerful family or a family transcendentalist, and you'll get a chance to finish what you didn't stop. If you stopped it, then you'll get a nice situation. You pick it up back up again if you want to. But if you never stopped and you didn't achieve perfection, you'll get carried right through, almost against your will. You'll just wind up being able to continue your work. It doesn't take away free will. It just takes away the idea that everything's over when you die. And what you started now, that level of realization you started with, you get to carry that through into your next lifetime. So you could almost imagine if you're running a race, you're 23 miles in, you drop in your next lifetime, and you're at that 23-mile mark with as much energy as you had, ready to finish the race. You follow? You just drop right back down and keep running. And when the yogi engages himself with sincere endeavor in making further progress, being washed of all contaminations, because you've still got to finish the course. Then ultimately achieving perfection after many, many bursts of practice, he attains the supreme goal. So Krishna's first thing was, you won't go to Durgati. That means a bad place. He says you will go to Paramgati, the best place. So this Durgati, a bad destination, Paramgati, the best destination. And so he winds it up here. He winds it up here. So there's his affection, calling Arjuna's son. There's the sincerity of Arjuna's question that brings out the best in the teacher. It's important for us to listen carefully so we can ask good questions so our teachers will dig into their cup of knowledge and pull out more for us. And there's these two possibilities where you gave it up or you never stopped but didn't finish. Krishna answers encouragingly to both. It would be tough to test this hypothesis, without getting in the lab and dying, coming back. But we can certainly point to the reasonableness of it if you believe in an all-good, all-powerful God, then we can dedicate ourselves to making those arguments, which I think is the way to go. And this question is ultimately the question that everybody has, because anybody who's interested in higher truth has already accepted that this world isn't all there is. And so this idea that we're not dealing with shallow people is assumed. A lot of us are just shallow. We make decisions based on our sensual desires and what have you, and they're not very deep. And sometimes we try to dress them up and make them sound more advanced than they actually are. But you find here, whether it's a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, they care about the afterlife. Even Habib Nurmagomedov, my favorite mixed martial arts fighter, who's a Dagestani, who's a Muslim, his father died, just a year before his father died. He said, I'd like to see a few more world champions come out of my school to make my school more famous. He goes, but nobody lasts forever, and if it's my time to go, I'm happy to go. This happens when you're a serious spiritualist, even if you're in like a weird tradition or you have a kind of a messed up conception of divinity and God's angry and violent or something like that. If you're a deep spiritualist, that deep spirituality, it makes you otherworldly. it makes you broad-minded. It makes you somewhat callous towards what goes on in this temporal abode. It gives you a depth, and you're able to lean on that as strength. And so Arjuna's question is quite sincere. And it might sound kind of Christian, am I going to go to heaven? But it's the type of question a spiritualist is naturally going to ask at some point. It's only when someone's a closet materialist or like an unstated materialist masquerading as a spiritualist that these questions don't become significant. And then Krishna says, you'll go to the Paramgati, the supreme abode. You won't go to Durgati, a bad place. And then Krishna winds up the chapter and he says, a yogi is greater than the ascetic. So a yogi is greater than the tapasvi, than an ascetic. And a yogi is also greater than the empiricist. A yogi is greater than the jnani. And the yogi is also greater than the pious worker, the fruitive worker. He's greater than the karmi. Therefore be a yogi. It's a famous verse. A yogi is greater than the ascetic, greater than the empiricist, and greater than the fruitive worker. Therefore, O Arjuna, in all circumstances be a yogi. It's a famous verse. Tapasvi bhyo diko yogi. One yogi is greater than all the tapasvis. Jnani bhyopi matodika. I consider him even greater than all the jnanis. One yogi. Karmi bhyaschadiko yogi. One yogi greater than all the karmis, all the pious workers. Now you could say karmi here couldn't mean karma, where you act for your own enjoyment, because Krishna's never recommended that the entire time. You follow? He's been contrasting karma yoga and jnana yoga, so clearly that's what he's talking about. So this yogi who's doing this kind of meditation is greater than everybody else. It's a really heavy statement. Therefore be a yogi. And then the last verse. Yoginam api sarvesham. And of all the yogis, all the different kinds of yogis you could be, matgatena, with me as the goal, antaratmana, within your heart with me as the goal, of all the yogis, shraddhavan, with faith, bhajate yo mam, one who worships me with faith. Bhajate is where you get the word bhakti from. Bhakti is a verb. It's one who does bhakti. Mam, to me. Shraddhavan, endowed with faith, having faith. Antaratmana, within himself. Madgatena, with me as the goal. Yogi namapi sarvesham, of all the yogis, the one who does that, samayukta tamo mataha. I consider him to be the most yogad. The most yogad. The most advanced. And of all yogis, the one with great faith who always abides in me, thinks of me within himself, and renders transcendental loving service to me, he is the most intimately united with me in yoga and is the highest of all. That is my opinion. Krishna literally says it's my opinion. He says that's my opinion. That they're yukta tama. They are the most yogad. And what's nice about this verse is that however much Krishna glorifies yoga in this chapter, and whatever Krishna is recommending in this chapter vis-a-vis yoga, and however that yoga could be contrasted to the yogas that Krishna taught previously that were much more based on doing your duty, and however you choose to resolve that divergence from what he's taught us for 5 consistent chapters, somehow or other, we wind up in exactly the same place. That you become a bhakta, and that's the highest of all. And in fact, after diverging, I've never said this before, I've never taught this before, after diverging most strongly and teaching like a version of spirituality that's most unlike bhakti, of renouncing the world and going and living in a cave, Krishna speaks up till this point in the Gita the most powerful verses in favor of bhakti, by creating a hierarchy where the bhakta is above all other types of spiritualists. He has not done this up till now in the Gita. And so as the apex as the zenith, as the topmost point, wrapping up the first 6 chapters, which are traditionally studied as 1/3 of the overall text, because they're all considering the nature of self in this world and how to act in this world. Whereas the second set of 6 chapters get into much more theological stuff. But to wrap up this section, Krishna speaks the most emphatic verses. After apparently diverging from the topic to engage with and flesh out the idea of a traditional yoga, the result of that is that Krishna then goes bigger than he's ever gone before and creates a hierarchy with the bhakta at the top of the list. Directly stating, a bhakta who's doing bhajan, who's worshiping me, who's doing it with faith, who's made me the goal of his life, that person is greater than the jnani, tapasvi, karmi. And of all the yogis, whatever yogi you think I met in this chapter, of all of them, this bhakta is the best. And so that's why we can fearlessly go through this chapter and look at it any way you want to, and fit it in with the rest of the Gita any way you want to, because the conclusion remains the same. And in fact, the conclusion becomes even more powerful if Krishna's engaging with like a really high system that not many people are qualified for, and that still results in you becoming a bhakta. Those are my thoughts on this section. I think we're almost done. We got a minute or two. If somebody wants to jump in and ask me a question or comment. Actually, let's wrap it on IGTV, huh? Thank you guys for participating.